I noticed something disturbing long before I understood it. I noticed that the people who collapse under pressure are not weak, and the people who remain calm are not fearless. That was the first illusion that shattered for me. Fear is not the enemy. Panic is not the problem. The real issue is far more subtle, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. I realized that the mind doesn't betray us in moments of intensity. It reveals who has been living unconsciously all along. I've watched brilliant people forget everything they knew the moment they were seen. I've watched confident voices tremble when attention landed on them. I've watched skill evaporate under the weight of expectation. And every time society whispered the same lie, you weren't ready. But that's not what I saw. What I saw was a mind that had never been trained to stand still when reality pushed back. There's a moment, and you know exactly what I mean, when the world seems to lean in, when time narrows, when consequences suddenly feel heavy, your body reacts before you do. Heart racing, breath tightening, thoughts accelerating like a machine with no off switch. In that moment, something takes over, and most people believe that something is them. That's the fatal mistake. When I first observed this in myself, it was humiliating. I wanted to believe I was in control. I wanted to believe my thoughts were mine, my reactions justified, my emotions meaningful. But under pressure, I wasn't acting, I was reacting. And reaction is not intelligence. Reaction is conditioning. I realized that the mind, under stress, does not become irrational. It becomes obedient. It obeys ancient biological scripts designed for survival, not for clarity, not for expression, not for truth. And the modern world exploits this mercilessly. By 2026, we are not overwhelmed because we lack information. We are overwhelmed because our nervous systems are being hijacked constantly, and no one taught us how to step out of the hijacking. I remember sitting quietly one morning, doing nothing special, when I noticed a thought arise, "You're falling behind." It came with urgency, pressure, a subtle threat, and instead of following it, instead of reacting, I simply watched it. That's when something extraordinary happened. The thought lost its authority. It didn't disappear, but it no longer commanded me. That was the first crack in the illusion. Most people think mastery is about accumulation, more skills, more techniques, more preparation. But I've come to understand that mastery is subtraction. It's removing the automatic obedience to mental noise. It's realizing that thoughts are events, not orders. When pressure rises, the untrained mind contracts. It narrows perception. It rushes towards certainty, even if that certainty is false. That's why people sabotage themselves at the worst possible moment. They don't fail because they don't know what to do. They fail because their identity collapses into fear. I saw this pattern repeated everywhere. In boardrooms, on stages, in relationships, in conflict. People aren't reacting to what's happening, they're reacting to what they think is happening. And those thoughts are rarely questioned. They feel urgent, so they feel true. I used to think confidence was something you needed before acting. That was another illusion. Confidence doesn't precede action. Confidence emerges when you stop resisting uncertainty. When I stopped trying to feel ready, and instead allowed myself to act while feeling exposed, something shifted. Fear no longer felt like a wall. It felt like weather. And weather doesn't require obedience. You don't negotiate with a storm. You observe it. You adjust. You move. What I learned is that the mind under pressure isn't trying to help you succeed. It's trying to protect an image, an identity, a story about who you are and how you should be perceived. And that image is fragile. It panics when threatened. It floods the system with doubt and urgency because it believes survival depends on approval. This is why calmness is so rare. Calmness threatens the ego. A still mind exposes the artificial nature of fear. It reveals that most of what we call pressure is socially manufactured. I began experimenting, not in isolation but in life. I let fear be present during conversations I wanted to avoid. I allowed my hands to shake. I let my voice waver. And instead of correcting it, I watched it. I stayed present. Something remarkable happened. The fear ran out of fuel, because fear feeds on resistance. By 2026, the world rewards speed, outrage, reaction. Platforms are engineered to bypass reflection. Attention is fragmented deliberately, and an untrained mind doesn't stand a chance. But a trained mind, a mind that knows how to remain still while stimuli scream, becomes something rare, something powerful. Stillness is not passivity. Stillness is clarity under load. I noticed that when I didn't immediately react, people became uncomfortable. Silence unsettled them. Calmness disrupted expectations. It's because most interactions are driven by unconscious emotional exchange. When you don't participate automatically, you break the script. This is where true power emerges, not the power to dominate, but the power to choose. Choice only exists in the gap between stimulus and response, and most people never experience that gap. Their lives are one long reflex. I remember realizing that the body reacts faster than thought. You can't stop the initial surge of adrenaline. You can't prevent the heartbeat from accelerating. But you can prevent interpretation from spiraling. You can prevent the story from taking over. And the story is what collapses people, not the sensation. When fear arises, the mind narrates. This is bad. This means something. This defines me. But when you observe instead of obey, the narrative dissolves. Sensation remains, but suffering does not. This understanding changed how I approached everything. Pressure stopped being a threat and became information. Anxiety became a signal, not a command. I wasn't trying to eliminate discomfort. I was learning to coexist with it without surrendering agency. The most dangerous belief I ever dropped was the belief that I needed to feel a certain way in order to act effectively. That belief paralyzes millions. Waiting to feel confident is a form of avoidance disguised as preparation. What matters is not how you feel, but whether you can remain present while feeling it. I saw clearly that the mind wants certainty, but reality doesn't offer it. The attempt to force certainty under pressure creates tension. Releasing the demand for certainty creates flow. That's not philosophy, that's observation. And the more I practiced this observation, the more space appeared. Space between thought and action. Space between emotion and identity. Space where intelligence operates without panic. I'm not talking about suppressing emotion. Suppression creates rigidity. I'm talking about inclusion without obedience. Letting everything arise without letting it steer. This is what separates those who know from those who can act when it matters. Knowledge collapses without presence. Technique evaporates without awareness. But awareness stabilizes everything else. By the time I understood this, it was obvious why so many people fail at the exact moment success is within reach. The mind, untrained, mistakes intensity for danger. It tightens, it rushes, it overcorrects. And in doing so, it destroys precision. I realized that a calm mind under pressure is not a personality trait. It's a practiced relationship with thought. And like any relationship, it can be trained, neglected, or transformed. And once you begin to see this, once you begin to experience that inner distance, there's no going back. Because you recognize something fundamental: you are not the storm. You are the awareness watching it form. I began to understand that awareness is not something you add to life. It is something you stop obscuring. The noise was always there, but so was the silence beneath it. What changed was not the world, but my relationship to the signals moving through my nervous system. I stopped treating every internal reaction as an emergency. I stopped assuming that intensity meant importance. That single shift rewired the way reality met me. Pressure no longer felt personal. It felt mechanical, a predictable surge of chemistry. A cascade of signals evolved for environments that no longer exist. Once I saw that clearly, I stopped romanticizing my anxiety. I stopped interpreting it as insight. Anxiety is not intuition. Anxiety is acceleration without direction. When I remained present, I noticed how quickly the mind tried to reclaim control. It offered strategies, judgments, memories, projections. It wanted resolution. It wanted closure. It wanted to escape uncertainty at any cost. And the cost was always awareness. The moment I followed the thought, I left the moment. The moment I left the moment, reaction replaced intelligence. I trained myself not by retreating from life, but by entering it more fully. I let situations unfold without rushing to define them. I let discomfort exist without naming it a problem. The body learned faster than the intellect. It began to recognize that stillness was not dangerous. That clarity did not require control. Over time, I noticed a strange reversal. Situations that used to overwhelm me now felt transparent, not because they became easier, but because I no longer collapsed into them. I stayed behind my eyes, anchored in observation. Events moved through awareness instead of dragging awareness into them. This changed how I spoke. Words became slower, more deliberate, not because I forced them, but because they no longer had to compete with panic. Silence stopped feeling awkward. It became spacious. In that space, meaning organized itself naturally. I saw how most conflict is fueled by unconscious identification. Someone reacts, the mind interprets, identity hardens, and suddenly two nervous systems are defending imaginary positions. When I refused to harden, the conflict lost momentum. Without resistance, there was nothing to push against. The world in 2026 is not designed for this kind of presence. It is designed for immediacy, reaction, constant stimulation. Algorithms reward outrage. Systems profit from agitation. A still mind becomes an anomaly. It cannot be easily manipulated. It cannot be easily predicted. I realized that calmness under pressure is not submission. It is refusal. Refusal to be pulled into pre-programmed responses. Refusal to surrender attention to external chaos. This refusal creates leverage, quiet leverage. As this deepened, fear changed texture. It became informational rather than directive. I could feel the surge without becoming the surge. I could notice the tightening without contracting around it. Sensation moved freely when it was not resisted. The mind kept offering interpretations, but I no longer treated them as commands. They were suggestions, nothing more. Some were useful. Most were noise. Discernment emerged naturally once obedience stopped. I observed how identity is the real trap. The need to be seen a certain way. The need to maintain coherence in the eyes of others. That need creates fragility. The more tightly identity is held, the more violently it reacts when threatened. When identity softened, adaptability increased. I could shift without feeling like I was losing myself, because I understood that the self I was protecting was mostly narrative. This understanding extended into action. Decisions became cleaner, less reactive, less performative. I was no longer acting to escape discomfort or secure validation. Action arose from alignment rather than urgency. I noticed that people sensed this, not consciously, but somatically. Interactions slowed. Tension dissipated. Presence communicates without words. A regulated nervous system invites regulation in others. The more I trusted observation, the less I needed reassurance. Certainty became unnecessary. I could move forward without knowing outcomes. I could stand in ambiguity without reaching for distraction. This is where real freedom began. Not freedom from fear, but freedom from its authority. Fear could exist without dictating behavior. That distinction is everything. I understood then why techniques fail under pressure. Techniques require mental bandwidth. Panic consumes bandwidth. Awareness, however, expands capacity. It creates room for technique to express itself naturally. Nothing was forced. Control was replaced by cooperation. The body knew what to do when the mind stopped interfering. I saw clearly that stillness is dynamic. It adjusts, it responds, it does not freeze. Only the ego freezes. Awareness flows. The longer I lived this way, the more artificial urgency appeared. Deadlines lost their threat. Evaluation lost its sting. Criticism passed through without embedding, not because I was indifferent, but because I was no longer identified. This was not detachment from life. It was deeper immersion. Experience became richer when filtered through presence instead of defense. I recognized that most exhaustion is not physical, it is cognitive. The constant management of internal resistance drains energy. When resistance dissolves, energy returns. In this state, attention becomes sharp, details emerge, timing improves. Action aligns with context instead of fighting it. I stopped chasing optimal states. I stopped trying to feel motivated. Motivation became irrelevant. Presence was sufficient. The mind still produced noise. Thought still arose. Emotion still surged. Nothing was eliminated. Everything was included. Inclusion without identification became the foundation. I understood that mastery is not control over experience. It is intimacy with it. Knowing sensation so well that it no longer surprises you. Knowing thought so well that it no longer deceives you. As this stabilized, life stopped feeling adversarial. Challenges appeared as movements rather than threats. Obstacles became configurations to navigate, not enemies to defeat. This is not mystical. It is practical. A nervous system that is not constantly triggered performs better under all conditions. Clarity scales. Panic does not. I saw how society trains the opposite. Constant evaluation, constant comparison, constant stimulation. The result is chronic reactivity mistaken for personality. Breaking that pattern is not dramatic. It is quiet, almost invisible. And that is why it is rare. I became aware that awareness itself does not strain. It does not rush. It does not demand. It simply illuminates. Everything else organizes around it. The more I trusted this, the less I interfered. The less I interfered, the more coherent my actions became. There was no endpoint to reach, no state to maintain, only a relationship to return to, again and again, and in returning, something fundamental stabilized, a center that did not depend on circumstance, a stillness that did not require silence, a clarity that did not require certainty. The storm continued, the world accelerated, pressure intensified, but none of that required collapse. I was no longer waiting for fear to disappear. I was no longer trying to conquer it. I was no longer negotiating with it. Fear became just another movement within awareness. Nothing more. nothing less. And from that position, action was clean, unforced, precise. The mind could no longer hijack the moment. Presence had reclaimed authority. That authority did not announce itself. It did not demand recognition. It simply operated. And once it was established, it could not be taken away by noise, speed, or pressure. It was already here, waiting to be noticed. What followed was not silence, but clarity layered beneath movement. Life did not slow down. If anything, it accelerated. Demands multiplied. Information intensified. The environment became louder, faster, more invasive. But the internal reference point no longer shifted. I could feel stimulation without fragmentation. I could register urgency without becoming urgent. This is where the real separation happens. Most people believe pressure comes from outside. Deadlines, expectations, competition, survival. But pressure only becomes destructive when it penetrates identity, when it convinces the mind that something essential is at risk. Once that illusion dissolves, intensity loses its sharp edge. I noticed how quickly situations attempted to provoke reflex, a comment, a look, a delay, a disruption. Each one an invitation to react, and reaction is addictive. It gives the illusion of participation, of control, of significance, but it drains coherence. I stopped granting automatic significance, not by dismissing events, but by meeting them without narrative, without commentary, without internal dramatization. Events unfolded and I remained intact. This altered the way time was experienced. Moments expanded. Decisions emerged with less friction. There was no need to rush because nothing was being chased. There was no need to defend because nothing essential was under threat. The modern mind is trained to equate movement with progress, constant adjustment, constant optimization, constant self-monitoring. But that endless recalibration creates instability. When attention is always elsewhere, presence never consolidates. I saw how this instability is profitable. Distracted minds are predictable. Reactive minds are steerable. A calm, observing mind becomes inconvenient. It does not amplify outrage. It does not escalate conflict. It does not fragment easily. Remaining centered in such an environment is not accidental. It is a deliberate withdrawal of allegiance from mental noise, a refusal to let external tempo dictate internal rhythm. I felt the body recalibrate. Breath deepened naturally. Muscles released without instruction. The nervous system learned that vigilance was no longer necessary. That safety did not depend on constant scanning. With that shift came endurance. Not the brittle endurance of force, but the fluid endurance of balance. Stress no longer accumulated in the same way. Recovery accelerated. Fatigue lost its psychological weight. I understood that much of what we call exhaustion is resistance to experience. Fighting what is already happening consumes enormous energy. Allowing what is happening to pass through awareness conserves it. As this integration continued, perception sharpened. Subtle cues became visible. Timing refined itself. Actions aligned more precisely with context. This was not intuition in the romantic sense. It was sensitivity without distortion. The mind still generated evaluations, but they arrived later, after perception, not before it. That sequencing mattered. Perception unfiltered by judgment is accurate. Judgment layered on too early blinds. I noticed how often people interrupt their own clarity with premature interpretation. They rush to label, to categorize, to conclude. In doing so, they close the field before it has fully revealed itself. Staying open longer changed outcomes. Conversations resolved differently. Conflicts dissolved before solidifying. Opportunities appeared that would have been invisible to a contracted mind. This was not strategy, it was consequence. When awareness remains wide, reality has room to respond. I saw clearly that most attempts at self-improvement actually reinforce the problem. They strengthen the sense of a deficient self needing correction. That sense of deficiency fuels anxiety. Anxiety demands control. Control tightens perception. Dropping the project of fixing myself released enormous bandwidth. Attention turned outward, not as avoidance, but as engagement without self-reference. This altered motivation fundamentally. Action was no longer driven by fear of inadequacy or desire for validation. It arose from curiosity, alignment, necessity. When action is not compensatory, it is efficient. I stopped measuring myself against imagined standards. Comparison dissolved. Without comparison, urgency softened. Without urgency, precision improved. The world responded differently, not magically but mechanically. Systems respond to stability. People respond to coherence. Situations de-escalate when not mirrored with agitation. I recognize that calmness under pressure is communicative. It signals safety. It alters the field. It slows the collective nervous system without instruction. This is why presence is disruptive. It interrupts feedback loops built on reaction. It introduces latency where immediacy was assumed. That latency is intelligence. The more I trusted this, the less I needed control. Control is a substitute for trust. Trust in perception. Trust in responsiveness. Trust in the capacity to meet whatever arises. I stopped rehearsing outcomes. Anticipation weakened. When the mind is no longer living in projected futures, it has access to current data. Current data is always more useful. I noticed how many mistakes are made by acting on assumptions rather than observations. Assumptions collapse nuance. Observation preserves it. Remaining observational under pressure is not passive. It is active receptivity. It allows for micro-adjustments that rigid plans cannot accommodate. This is where adaptability emerges, not as flexibility forced by circumstance, but as responsiveness rooted in presence. When identity is not at stake, change is not threatening. I saw how identity clings most tightly under scrutiny. Being watched activates self-consciousness. Self-consciousness fractures attention. Attention fragmentation degrades performance. By removing identification with performance, performance stabilized. Ironically, letting go of control increased effectiveness. I no longer needed to prove composure. Composure became irrelevant. What mattered was continuity of awareness. This continuity extended across domains: work, interaction, solitude. Pressure no longer created discontinuity. There was no shift between who I was and what I did. I realized that what people admire as confidence is actually consistency of presence, not bravado, not certainty, but coherence under fluctuation. The mind wants resolution. Awareness tolerates ambiguity. Ambiguity is fertile. Resolution is terminal. By staying unresolved longer, deeper patterns revealed themselves. Surface reactions gave way to underlying dynamics. Acting from that level produced different results. This is not something you adopt. It is something that emerges when interference stops, when attention stops chasing reassurance, when identity stops demanding protection. The body senses this immediately. It responds with regulation. Regulation supports clarity. Clarity supports action. I understood that stillness is not an absence of movement, but an absence of friction. Movement continues, but without resistance. Once friction dissolves, effort decreases, not because tasks vanish, but because opposition to them does. The environment will continue to intensify. Systems will accelerate. Stimuli will multiply. This is not a temporary condition. It is structural. In such a world, the ability to remain internally unmoved becomes not a luxury, but a necessity. Without it, collapse is inevitable. With it, navigation becomes possible. This capacity is not rare because it is difficult. It is rare because it is countercultural. It does not reward reaction. It does not feed spectacle. It does not produce immediate gratification. It produces stability. Stability compounds. Over time, this compounding becomes visible. Decisions age well. Relationships stabilize. Work accumulates coherence instead of entropy. I did not become invulnerable. Sensitivity remained. What changed was permeability. Experience passed through without lodging. The mind still spoke. The body still reacted. The world still challenged. But nothing displaced the center. That center was never created. And once uncovered, it did not require maintenance, only recognition. Recognition returned attention to itself, again and again. From there, everything else organized naturally. From there, something irreversible settled in, not as a belief, not as an achievement, but as a baseline. I was no longer practicing presence as a method. Presence had become the ground. Everything else moved on top of it. Thoughts came and went. Emotions rose and dissolved. Circumstances shifted. But the reference point remained stable, not because I held it, but because I stopped abandoning it. I began to see how rarely people ever arrive where they are. Most lives are spent in rehearsal or regret, anticipating what might happen, replaying what already did. Very little time is spent actually inhabiting the moment where action is possible. This is not accidental. A present mind is difficult to govern. It doesn't respond predictably. It doesn't panic on command. It doesn't amplify manufactured urgency. As the world pushed harder, demanded faster responses, louder reactions, stronger opinions, I noticed something unexpected. The calmer I remained, the more gravity my words carried. Not because they were forceful, but because they were unhurried. When speech is not rushed by fear, it lands differently. It penetrates rather than collides. I saw how often people confuse intensity with truth. Loud certainty masquerades as authority. But real authority is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need reinforcement. It is felt before it is understood. This realization changed how I engage with power structures. Institutions thrive on compliance through pressure. They depend on emotional reflex. When reflex is absent, leverage disappears. A regulated mind cannot be bullied easily. It does not escalate when provoked. It does not submit when threatened. It evaluates. Evaluation requires space. Space exists only where reaction is suspended. By remaining centered, I stopped feeding cycles that depended on my agitation. Arguments dissolved. Manipulations failed. Deadlines lost their coercive force. I still acted. I still delivered. But action was no longer extracted through fear. It emerged through clarity. I understood then that freedom is not granted. It is assumed. It begins the moment internal sovereignty is reclaimed. No external condition can provide that. No external condition can remove it either. This sovereignty does not reject emotion. It contextualizes it. Sadness can arise without becoming despair. Anger can arise without becoming violence. Excitement can arise without becoming recklessness. Each emotion is allowed its movement, but none are permitted to seize the steering wheel. That distinction reshapes character. What others perceive as composure is simply non-identification, the refusal to confuse passing states with enduring self. Over time, this refusal becomes natural, automatic, effortless. There is no longer a need to remind oneself to stay calm. Calmness is no longer an act. It is the absence of interference. I saw clearly that the mind's greatest trick is urgency. Urgency compresses time. It collapses nuance. It forces premature action. When urgency is questioned, its authority dissolves. Most urgency is artificial, designed to bypass discernment. When discernment is restored, choice reappears. Choice is the core of dignity. Without choice, action is mechanical. With choice, action is ethical. This reframed responsibility. Responsibility was no longer about reacting correctly under pressure. It was about maintaining clarity so that response could be appropriate. That subtle shift changed outcomes consistently. I no longer mistook discomfort for danger. Discomfort became a signal to pay attention, not to retreat. Growth stopped being dramatic. It became incremental, cumulative, stable. As this stabilized, I noticed something deeply unsettling about modern culture. We have normalized dysregulation. Anxiety is treated as motivation. Burnout is treated as commitment. Reactivity is treated as authenticity. Calmness is often misread as indifference. But indifference is numbness. Calmness is sensitivity without collapse. They are opposites. I recognized how early this confusion is installed. From childhood, we are rewarded for speed, punished for hesitation, conditioned to perform rather than perceive. Over time, perception atrophies, reaction dominates. Reversing this is not rebellion in the traditional sense. It is quieter, more radical. It begins internally, but it has external consequences. A person who cannot be easily provoked cannot be easily controlled. This does not make one superior. It makes one responsible. With clarity comes accountability. Without emotional excuses, actions stand on their own. I stopped outsourcing my state to circumstances. Good day or bad day no longer dictated presence. Presence dictated the quality of the day. This was not optimism. It was agency. Agency does not mean control over outcomes. It means authorship over response. Outcomes remain uncertain. Response becomes deliberate. I saw how many lives are lived in reaction to imagined futures. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of loss. These futures rarely arrive as predicted. But the cost of preparing for them is paid daily in stress, tension, distraction. By returning attention to what was actually happening, most of that cost vanished. Energy reclaimed itself. Focus sharpened. Endurance increased. This endurance was not the hard endurance of willpower. It was the soft endurance of alignment. When actions are not in conflict with internal state, fatigue reduces dramatically. I noticed that creativity thrived here. When the mind is not defending itself, it explores ideas connected naturally. Insight surfaced without force. Expression became fluid. This is where the deeper implication emerged. A still mind is not only resilient, it is generative. It produces coherence rather than chaos. In a world increasingly shaped by artificial intelligence, automation, and algorithmic amplification, this human capacity becomes decisive. Machines excel at speed. They excel at repetition. They excel at optimization. They do not excel at presence. Presence is the irreducible human advantage, but it cannot coexist with constant reactivity. It requires a nervous system capable of remaining open under load. Those who cultivate this will not simply perform better. They will perceive differently. They will see patterns others miss. They will sense shifts before they become crises. They will act earlier with less force. This is not mystical foresight. It is sensitivity unclouded by panic. As the world moves further into complexity, linear solutions fail. Control-based models collapse. Only adaptive intelligence remains viable. Adaptive intelligence depends on awareness. I realize that what many call wisdom is simply familiarity with impermanence. When impermanence is accepted, fear loses its grip. When fear loses its grip, clarity emerges. Clarity does not guarantee success, it guarantees integrity. And integrity compounds over time. It builds trust. It builds consistency. It builds resilience. I no longer measured progress by intensity of effort. I measured it by stability of attention. When attention remained stable, results followed naturally. This stability did not isolate me. It connected me more deeply. Without defensive barriers, communication improved. Listening deepened. Understanding widened. I saw that most misunderstandings arise not from difference of opinion, but from difference of state. Two dysregulated systems cannot resolve conflict. At least one must stabilize. Stabilization is contagious. Calm spreads faster than panic when not resisted. This understanding carried ethical weight. Remaining regulated was no longer just self-care. It was contribution. A regulated presence reduces collective volatility. I understood then why ancient traditions emphasized stillness, not as withdrawal, but as preparation. A still mind is not empty. It is ready for complexity, ready for uncertainty, ready for responsibility. I stopped seeking peak experiences. I stopped chasing transformation. Transformation had already occurred in the background, quietly, through consistency. What remained was maintenance of attention, not vigilance. Remembrance, remembering to return, again and again. This return did not require effort, only honesty. The honesty to notice when attention drifted into narrative. The honesty to come back without judgment. Judgment weakens return. Acceptance strengthens it over years. This became second nature. Not perfect, not constant, but reliable enough to trust. Trust is essential. Without trust and awareness, the mind reverts to control. Control reintroduces tension. Tension degrades perception. Trust closes that loop. At this stage, fear still appeared. But it appeared as movement, not meaning. It could inform without commanding. It could alert without dominating. This is the difference between a signal and a story. Signals are useful. Stories enslave. I learned to listen to signals and ignore stories. Stories want certainty. Signals want response. Responding to reality instead of narrating it changed everything. As the external world continues to destabilize, this internal stability becomes non-negotiable. Systems will fail. Narratives will collapse. Certainties will erode. Those anchored in reaction will fragment. Those anchored in awareness will adapt. This is not survivalism. It is realism. The future does not belong to the loudest, the fastest, or the most reactive. It belongs to those who can remain present when complexity peaks. Presence is not passive. It is the condition for intelligent action. I stand firmly in this understanding now, not as belief, but as lived reality. I have watched fear dissolve into information. I have watched pressure lose its teeth. I have watched clarity replace urgency. And I know this with certainty: the most powerful thing you can cultivate in this era is not confidence, not discipline, not control. It is the capacity to remain internally unmoved while everything around you accelerates. An unwavering mind does not resist the world, it meets it. And when the world realizes it cannot shake you, it changes how it treats you. That is not dominance, that is alignment. And alignment, once established, becomes unbreakable.